as well as his parents. Two of Keith's aunts were at the house, Mimi and Sandra. Sandra had also brought her two kids, Keith's cousins. Keith wanted to say hello to all of them. The food was already prepared, and it seemed that everyone was waiting for him. Keith could tell something was up. He looked from the troubled expressions on his parents' faces to the way his aunts were eyeing him, and he wondered what was going on. The only person he couldn't see was his sister, Megan. Megan was a bit of a wild child, and Keith had no idea where she might be. Sure enough, after only a few mouthfuls, Aunt Sandra said, "So, Keith, I heard about the bank robbery from your dad. The mayor's office rewarded you with $20,000, right?" Keith nodded honestly and said, "Yes, that's right." Sandra looked delighted. "And you know that the college entrance exam is coming up? Jaden's been scoring so high that he'll have no problem getting into his first-choice school." Keith frowned a little as he started to see where this might be going. "Well," Sandra beamed, "I've already told your dad that the $20,000 can go toward Jaden's tuition. Once he earns it back in the future, he can pay you back." Keith was stunned. He looked at his father and saw the resignation on his face. He must have had an idea of what was going on. Keith's father was an honest man, and Sandra was an unreasonable woman. She knew how to get what she wanted, and once she started making a fuss, his father had probably been browbeaten into agreeing to her request. Keith's mother, Angela, was kind by nature, but she'd never stand up to her sisters-in-law. If his father agreed, his mother would go along with it. Keith frowned and looked at his cousin Jaden, and then at Sandra. Her smile remained enthusiastic, but there was a hint of disdain in her eyes. Keith smiled and said, "Sorry, Aunt Sandra. I really need that money. I'm sure you'll find somewhere else to borrow Jaden's tuition money." "What?" Sandra couldn't sit still when she heard his reply. She said angrily, "You're just a police technician. What do you need the money for? A family's money should be spent where it's needed most. Jaden is going to college soon. He needs to pay tuition, living expenses, and so on. He needs to get a girlfriend. He needs money for real things. We only want to borrow it. It's not like you won't get it back." His cousin Jaden, who'd been silent all this while, said proudly, "Don't worry, Keith. When I graduate, I'll start my own business. I'll make sure to look after you then. You won't have to be a police grunt anymore. Invest in me now. I'll make it worth your while in the future." Keith could hear they were mocking him. His stomach clenched, but on the surface he stayed cool. "Hey, Aunt Sandra, didn't you borrow $7,000 from my dad last year? And you still haven't paid a single cent back, right? So why are you borrowing money again?" Jaden shut his mouth and didn't say another word, but Sandra replied, "Your father and I are siblings. It's what family does." She sniffed. "And what's gotten into you? You used to be so well-mannered. Is this what they teach you down at the precinct? To disrespect your elders?" Keith took a sip of his Coke and said lightly, "No, this is what you've taught me, Auntie. I'm only imitating your way of speaking to people." Sandra's mouth dropped open, and Keith carried on. "Uncle Mike's been in business all these years. Are you seriously telling me you and your husband can't afford your own son's tuition fees? Speaking of which, I've been meaning to drop by your place to ask about the money you already owe us. You've been borrowing bits here and there for years. I think it's around 40 or 50,000 by now, right?" Sandra choked on her soda, but Keith didn't let up. "Since you're here now, I'll ask you straight. When are you going to return our money?" The room was stunned into silence. Compared to before, Keith seemed like a whole different person. In the past, he was submissive and obedient, but now, not only was he refusing to give away his money, he was even asking his aunt to pay back what she owed. As Sandra gaped at him, she wondered who the hell this new Keith was and what he'd done with her nephew. As they stared at their son, Keith's parents' eyes grew as big as dinner plates, but it was Sandra who looked like she might keel over any minute now. For a moment, no one said a thing. The scene was incredibly awkward. Keith took another mouthful of soda and continued to look at Sandra calmly. His aunt had always bullied them. Keith's father had suffered a lot from her. His parents were honest, and his sister was still young. Well, Keith wasn't going to let them put up with Sandra's crap any longer. Sandra was furious. This little punk had dared to talk back to her, and now he was demanding that she pay back the money? It was intolerable. She stood up and angrily addressed Keith's father. "We agreed on this, Sam. Why are you letting your son change your mind now? Aren't you the man of this house?" Sam took a swig of beer before answering, but when he tried to get up and say something, he was stopped by Keith. Sam looked down in confusion at the hand on his shoulder. It had a gentle but irresistible power to it. Looking at his son's calm, composed expression, a light bulb clicked on in Sam's head. His son had grown up. The little hands that used to cling to his dad had become strong and capable. Sam had worked hard for over half of his life, but he'd still managed to raise his son properly. The realization made him feel sad and gratified at the same time, and his eyes grew a little misty. Without saying a word, he lowered his head and took another sip of beer. This time, it didn't taste so bitter. Keith spoke up. "I don't think you're in a position to ask who the real man is, Sandra, when you're here asking your brother for more money while your husband sits at home." Sandra's face turned ugly. On the other side of her, Keith's other cousin, Travis, stood up and yelled, "You saying my dad isn't a real man? Say it again. I dare you." Keith slammed his hand on the table and it broke with a sharp crack. The dishes clattered to the floor. Keith stood up suddenly and said in a cold voice, "What? So you can talk down to people, but no one else is allowed to talk back? Is that it?" He stepped up to Travis and said slowly, "Listen carefully. If you're going to come around here and say my father's not treating his family right, you better be prepared to hear some home truths in return. Understand?" A powerful aura seemed to crackle in the air around Keith, and the rest of the family felt a chill run down their spines. Travis was afraid. With a jolt, he remembered that only a few days ago, Keith had single-handedly dealt with 3 armed robbers. Travis started to tremble uncontrollably. Looking back at Keith's terrifying eyes, he fell to the ground. Keith looked down at his cousin and then turned to Sandra. When he saw the fear on their faces, he knew he'd achieved the desired effect. He snorted and said, "We're all family here. I won't argue with you anymore. But if you dare speak rudely to my parents again, don't blame me for the consequences." As the saying went, nice guys finish last. In the past, his family was too accommodating. But now, Keith would make sure that the situation was reversed. For a moment, no one dared to speak. Sandra's skirt was still splattered with the knocked-over spaghetti. Previously, she would probably have been angry about it. But now she looked at Keith in silence, her face full of fear. Keith said coldly, "I will not lend you the money. Don't ask me again." Sandra was shocked at Keith's blunt words, but she was also unwilling to give up. She relied on her fierceness, and her husband was a shrewd businessman. In the past, she'd always been domineering with her relatives, but in this instance, her nephew was even fiercer than she was, and what's more, he didn't seem bothered by the thought of falling out with her. His words were spoken with such decisiveness. At that moment, the systems chimed in Keith's mind. "You've shattered Sandra's and your cousin's wish to mock you. Attribute point, +1. You've fulfilled your parents' wish to not lend money. Wish value, +1. System prompt. Respecting one's elders is very important. This is the first time you fulfilled a parent's wish. Hidden reward unlocked. 1 random skill will be awarded the maximum level. System is selecting a random skill for you. Please wait." What? Before Keith could react, the system's voice sounded again. "Host obtains maximum skill level in culinary mastery." Culinary mastery? You want me to be a cook? Keith was slightly stunned, but then the corners of his mouth turned up to form a beautiful arc. Having more skills wouldn't add any pressure on him. In fact, the more skills, the better. Ignoring the system in his mind, he looked at his mother and said gently, "Mom, don't you have a notebook where you keep a record of your accounts? Bring it out so Sandra can take a look. We're going to settle the accounts properly, work out how much money she owes, and when she plans on paying it back." At that point, Sandra finally came back to her senses and screamed, "Keith, you're pushing your luck. Remember who my husband is? Don't think he won't get someone to teach you a lesson." Keith's eyes turned icy cold. "Are you threatening me?" He stepped over to Sandra and said coldly, "I don't care who you are. I hate nothing more than when people try to threaten me. Do you want to repeat what you just said?" Sandra felt like she was a rabbit in the sights of a hunter. She thought that if she dared say another word, the wolf would tear her apart without hesitation. She looked at Keith in fear and said with a trembling voice, What are you doing?" The rest of the family was stunned by this change in Keith's demeanor. They looked at him in a daze, hardly even daring to breathe. Just then, the doorbell rang. There was a collective flinch before Keith's mother ran to open the door. The group of people standing outside only increased her jitteriness. 7 or 8 people in suits bustled into the house. The leader was a middle-aged man with a kind face, who Keith recognized from TV. This was the mayor of Summerfield. Behind him was the chief of police, James Cooper, and Keith's supervisor, Sergeant Quinn Taylor. Although he didn't know the rest of the people, Keith could tell they thought they were important. It was then that he remembered what Quinn had told him at the hospital. The mayor's office and the senior police team would be visiting him at home for a congratulatory press shoot. He hadn't expected them to come so soon. The mayor smiled and said, "Keith, right? I heard about your story. You've done a great service for our community. You've helped get rid of the scourge of our society. It's so great to meet such young and promising residents of Summerfield." The man stretched out his hand as he spoke, and Keith quickly stepped forward and shook it. "You flatter me, sir. I was only doing what was necessary. Please, come in and take a seat. I'm sorry if it's a bit of a mess. I wasn't expecting you so soon. It was only then that the crowd looked around and realized what a state the room was in. The floor was covered in smashed dishes and splattered spaghetti. The men laughed and said, Keith, looks like you had a tornado through here. Keith scratched his head in embarrassment, while James winked at him from over the man's shoulder. He grabbed a rag from the sink. Just a minute, sir. Let me clean this up. Keith and his dad scrambled to clean up the mess, while his mom got everyone seated and fetched them drinks. When they were done, the mayor invited Keith to join him on the couch and began chatting away amiably with Keith and his parents. Sandra couldn't believe her eyes. Jaden, Travis, and Aunt Mimi were just as shocked. One of the most prominent leaders in Summerfield had come to Sam's house as a guest and had even brought a camera. Was that young man with them a reporter? Even more surprising was the attitude of Keith, James, and Quinn as they talked. They looked like old acquaintances, chatting away comfortably. These two were respected figures in Summerfield. Could it be possible that Keith was friends with them? Good heavens, Sandra thought to herself. If it hadn't been happening right in front of their eyes, Sandra and the others would never have believed it. She didn't know whether she should stay or not. The thing is, two of the VIP group were standing by the door chatting away. Sandra didn't even dare to walk through them. She realized how childish her words had been just now. Her husband ran a local business and knew a lot of people in the community, but compared to the group in this house, it was nothing. Keith took in the expressions of the people around him one by one, and he couldn't help but laugh to himself. But when his gaze landed on his cousin Travis, Keith did a double take. Travis's eyes were shining as he looked at the camera lady. The woman operating the camera was beautiful as Quinn. No wonder Travis was so entranced when he saw her. At that moment, there was an angry voice beside his ear. Keith, some of the most important people in Summerfield are here. What are you staring at? The voice was Quinn's. Keith instinctively shrank back when he heard her and hurriedly looked away from the camera woman. Quinn saw this and snorted. She rolled her eyes at Keith as she seemed to realize something. Her ears turned slightly red. Just then, Keith's mom, who'd been chatting away merrily with her guests, suddenly said, You must have come straight from work. I guess you haven't eaten yet, right? Why don't I get you some food? The mayor looked at Keith with a twinkle in his eye. Keith had left a very good impression on him. The young man was polite, but not too humble in front of his superiors, and the way he spoke and conducted himself was impressive. The mayor could tell that Keith was a highly capable young man. For the first time, the mayor addressed James, who was standing beside him. Chief Cooper, should we have something to eat before we leave? James chuckled. All right. We have a lot of people, though, Mrs. Sanderberg. I don't want to trouble you. Keith's mother waved him off with a smile and was about to head into the kitchen when Sandra's eyes lit up. She blurted out, Oh, but Mayor Anderson, don't you know Keith is a fantastic cook? In fact, why not let him show you his culinary skills by making you dinner? Episode 14, Culinary Mastery. Oh? The mayor said curiously. Keith, I didn't know you had such a wide range of talents. It seems we're in luck today. Even Quinn looked over with a trace of curiosity in her eyes. Keith frowned slightly. He didn't know how to cook. Sandra was clearly trying to embarrass him in front of his superiors, but the mayor had already spoken. and he seemed genuinely excited that Keith was going to cook for them all. It didn't really leave Keith with many choices. If this had happened to old Keith, he might have just run away at this point. But now, he stood up and said with a smile, "It'd be my pleasure to cook for you all. I'll be right back." Keith's parents looked at each other. Keith barely ever set foot in the kitchen, other than to grab the occasional midnight bowl of cereal. How could he possibly cook a whole meal? Keith's mother wanted to go and help him, but the mayor laughed and said, "Let the young people do it, Mrs. Sanderberg. I'm sure you deserve a night off." "Quinn," James winked, "why don't you go help Keith? You still owe him a favor." Quinn was happy to help. Since Keith was on her team, she'd received a share of the credit when he caught the bank robbers, and once she'd connected the criminals to the string of robberies from a few years back, her captain had started talking about her next promotion. Although she'd already thanked Keith in person, she still felt like she owed him. Furthermore, she wanted to see if the hammer fist expert really could cook as well. She stood up and nodded before making her way out of the room. A cold smile spread across Sandra's face as she watched them both disappear into the kitchen. Her evil plan was working. In the kitchen, Keith stared at the pile of food in front of him, and the corners of his mouth curled up. He picked up a kitchen knife and got to work chopping vegetables. Culinary mastery skill activated. Keith's movements became almost invisible to the naked eye as he diced the shallots. As Quinn watched from beside him, her face revealed a look of disbelief. Keith's knife technique was superb. He was so fast that his hand was a blur, and on top of that, every slice was cut evenly, as if processed by a machine. Quinn could barely believe her eyes. The rhythmic sound of the knife hitting the chopping board was intoxicating, and every step looked like a work of art. Quinn watched in a daze, unable to tear her eyes away. She didn't even dare make a sound, as if her words would break the wonderful scene before her. Just minutes later, there was a sizzle of stir-frying, and the fragrance of the dish floated through the kitchen, making her mouth water. The aroma drifted into the living room, and though everyone continued chatting casually, their thoughts drifted away as they caught a whiff of the delicious food. Each and every one of them swallowed discreetly as they began to salivate. 20 minutes later, looking at the table full of steaming dishes, the mayor laughed. "Oh, Keith, you really are something. You caught a group of seasoned criminals, and you whipped us up a feast. I can't wait to see if this tastes as good as it smells." The mayor scooped up a forkful of food. The moment it was in his mouth, his eyes went wide and he let out a groan. He saw the table full of people staring at him in anticipation, and he swallowed and looked up to Keith, saying, "I've never tasted such delicious chicken in my life." The others all gasped. It must be the most delicious food in the world. James saw this and couldn't bear it any longer. He laughed and said, "Wow, is it really that delicious? I'll try it too." He picked up a piece of chicken and put it in his mouth. His expression was even more exaggerated than the mayor's, but the difference was that he didn't say anything. He just kept shoveling food into his mouth, as if he was going to swallow his own tongue. When the others saw this, they didn't wait any longer. One by one, they took the food and began to stuff it into their mouths. Then, there was a burst of exclamations. As Quinn chewed, her eyes narrowed to slits. She'd eaten quite a number of delicacies in her life, but compared to the home-cooked dishes in front of her, there was a world of difference. She was growing more and more impressed with Keith. Keith's parents heaved a sigh of relief at the same time and looked at their son with a smile. Their child had finally grown up, and it looked as though he had a promising future ahead of him. You fulfilled everyone's wish to eat delicious food. Wish value +1. Current progress 4 of 10. Meanwhile, Sandra's face was filled with disbelief. How is this possible? I didn't think Keith ever stepped foot in the kitchen. She tried a mouthful of food, and her expression turned from shock to enjoyment before finally settling into an ugly expression. When Keith saw this, he said, "Oh, what's wrong, Sandra? Is it no good? I know you wanted to make a fool of me, so I'm sorry to disappoint you." He said all this in front of everyone else. If this woman dared to embarrass him in front of so many senior figures, then Keith would fight back. Once he'd shed all pretense of cordiality, there was no need to be polite. He would stand up for himself and his family, no matter what. The others looked over in surprise at his words, but after thinking it through, they seemed to understand. As they devoured the delicious meal, they observed Sandra in silent judgment. The mayor seemed to have guessed what had happened. He laughed and said, "Keith, is this your aunt? What's going on? Tell me." Keith smiled. It's no big deal. It's just that Sandra owes my family tens of thousands of dollars. She came to borrow money again this evening, and it caused some conflict." The mayor frowned and looked at Sandra. "Why are you behaving like this? You're all family. If Keith can't lend you any more money, why would you make things difficult? The people of Summerfield are very particular about paying their debts. Keith's family don't have it any easier than you. And you don't seem to have a good reason not to return the money. So why haven't you paid back yet?" Sandra felt like she'd swallowed a fly. She didn't dare to refute the mayor's claims. She merely lowered her head and nodded. At that point, Quinn smiled and said, "Mayor Anderson, mobile payments are so easy nowadays. Money can be returned with just a swipe." Although Quinn seemed like an iceberg at work, she was very protective of her subordinates. How could she let one of her team suffer? Her words made it clear that Sandra should return the money on the spot. Sandra was stunned. Her sons, Travis and Jaden, were equally dumbfounded. It had only been 2 months since they last saw each other, but in that time, their cousin had managed to establish a terrifying network of connections. Some of the biggest names in the city were speaking up for Keith. Everyone at the table turned to look at Sandra. There was a faint smirk on James's lips. At that point, Sandra knew that she had to return the money. If she said no now, her husband would be out of business by tomorrow. Episode 15, Set Up for Success. Sandra bit the bullet and took out her phone. Keith calmly took out his new iPhone and smiled. "Is Google Pay okay for you, Sandra?" Sandra smiled bitterly. All these years, she'd always looked down on her brother and his family, but now her nephew had found a way to force her to return the money she owed them. She realized she'd have to be more careful in front of Keith from now on. In no time at all, almost $50,000 was deposited into Keith's account. He smiled in satisfaction. You've completed your parents' wish for Sandra to return their money. Wish value +1. Progress 5 of 10. You've shattered Sandra's wish to not pay you back. Attribute point, +1. As the mayor continued to eat, he smiled and said, "Keith, you've such good culinary skills. If you decided to open a restaurant, you'd make a fortune." James laughed and said, "If Keith opens a restaurant, I'll eat there every day." The others laughed too, and the atmosphere lightened up again. Keith was silent for a moment before he said, "Actually, there's something that I've been meaning to discuss with you." The mayor smiled and said, "Keith, you're a local hero. If you have a problem, just tell us. We'll do whatever we can to help you." "Well," Keith replied, "I just signed up for the college entrance exam so I can go back to school. If I get in, it means I'll have to resign from the team." There was a stunned silence at Keith's announcement, but the mayor laughed once more and said, "Well, that's great news. It's good that you want to continue your education. With your talent, you can get a degree and go into whatever field you choose. You're setting yourself up for success." James said, "Keith, academic qualifications are certainly important. Are you interested in applying to the police academy?" Keith was a little taken back. He thought that his superiors would be unhappy if he resigned. He hadn't expected them to offer him an olive branch. Keith's parents were overjoyed to see their son treated so well by the city's leaders. It was a great honor, and they couldn't wait to tell their friends all about it. Most importantly, their son finally understood the value of going to college. This was the most pleasant surprise. Sam secretly made up his mind. He was going back to work. He had to provide for his son. You fulfilled your parents' wish for you to apply to college. Wish value +1. Sandra and her two sons widened their eyes. Travis snorted in disdain. Although he didn't say anything, the meaning was obvious. You think you can get into college? You won't even pass the exams. Everyone had their own thoughts, but Quinn's expression was a little complicated. On one hand, she hoped that Keith would have a better future, but when she thought about Keith resigning, she felt a little uncomfortable in her heart. Suddenly, there was a yelp from the corner of the room. The beautiful camera woman had slipped and fallen to the ground. She seemed to have sprained her ankle. Travis had been taken with her from the moment he saw her, and seeing her hurt, he was the first to rush over to help. The young woman seemed shaken. After being helped by Travis, she blurted out a string of thanks in Spanish. Seeing that the young woman was fine, the mayor laughed and said, "This is Isabella Guzman from our publicity department. She grew up in Ecuador and has come over here to work with us. She's still learning English." Keith nodded, but Travis seemed to want to show off in front of the city leaders. He started speaking to Isabella in Spanish. But even if Travis's grades were good, he didn't have much experience with native Spanish speakers. Isabella blinked, clearly unable to understand what Travis was saying. Seeing this, Keith smiled and stepped forward. In fluent Spanish, he asked if she was hurt and politely helped her over to the couch. It was rare to meet someone of the same age who could communicate fluently with her in Spanish, and Isabella was delighted. Even in Spanish, Keith was witty and amiable, and with his 3-point charm value, he had an undeniable charisma. Isabella laughed at something he said, and the others looked at Keith in surprise before smiling. The mayor said to James, "Keith's Spanish is so good for such a young age. Maybe I should hire him as my secretary." James laughed and said, You'll have to fight me for him, Mayor Anderson. I think he'd be an outstanding candidate for the police academy." The mayor laughed when he heard that. The more he saw of Keith, the more he liked him. Quinn also looked at Keith. She'd had no idea how talented he was. But when she thought of this charismatic guy flirting with beautiful women, she felt upset. Meanwhile, Travis's mouth was hanging open, and he looked at Keith in disbelief. Travis had always been confident in Spanish, but Keith, the cousin he'd always looked down on, was actually so much better than him. He was so fluent. He could even crack jokes. Those who didn't know him would think he was a native Spanish speaker. But being mercilessly defeated in his field of expertise, Travis was both angry and resentful. But he couldn't do a thing about it. Keith's parents were beaming with joy. Their son was making them proud. Meanwhile, Aunt Sandra and Aunt Mimi's jaws had dropped to the floor. Keith had shocked them to the core. Ding! You fulfilled Isabella's wish to communicate with her peers. Wish value +1. You've shattered Travis's wish to show off in front of a beautiful woman. Ability value +1. Keith's lips curled. After chatting casually for a while, he returned to his seat. Since it was getting late, the guests wrapped up their conversations and then left one after another. Under Quinn's watchful eye, Keith and Isabella exchanged numbers and added each other on Instagram. Sandra and the other relatives also left, with their tails between their legs. Sandra had suffered a huge loss. Not only had she not been able to borrow any more money, but she'd also been made to repay $50,000. After they'd finished clearing up, Keith transferred the $50,000 to his father. They chatted for a while before Keith finally remembered the original point of the evening. He asked, "Dad, didn't you say you had something you wanted to talk about?" Sam rubbed his eyes and sighed. "I almost forgot." He took a letter from a drawer and handed it to Keith. "Take a look." Keith scanned the letter and frowned. It was from his grandfather, and it said that years ago he had agreed with his close friend that their future children would be engaged when they were old enough. But both families had had sons, and so the arrangement had passed on to their grandchildren instead. Sam sighed and said, "Your grandfather passed away years ago, but his friend kept this letter and never forgot about their arrangement. The letter arrived today. In a few days' time, he'll bring his granddaughter to see you. He's already seen your photo and has your contact details. You should prepare yourself." Keith was well aware that this must be the wife chosen by the system. He hadn't expected it to happen like this, though. It was so old-fashioned. But Keith knew he had been the one to make the wish. All he could do now was accept the consequences. Episode 16, Revenge is a Black Snake. After talking it over for a while longer, Keith decided to go back to the police barracks to sleep. It wasn't that he didn't want to stay at home, but he was worried that if Blake came to seek revenge, his parents would be in danger. The issue was a ticking time bomb. He knew that it would explode sooner or later. His parents trusted him completely. They didn't ask him about the $20,000, and Keith didn't tell them what he was going to do next. As he walked along under the night sky, Keith began to count his gains. His wish value was up to 5 now, and he was getting closer to making his next wish. He'd also obtained 3 attribute points. Without hesitating, He added another point to his power stat and 2 more points to dexterity. That meant that now his attributes were power, 14, dexterity, 19, stamina, 11, charm, 3, wish value, 5 of 10. Skills, recovery from injury, hammer fist proficiency, eye of detection, throwing proficiency, culinary mastery, instant memorization, and optimal logic. It had only been a few days since Keith had obtained the system, and he was pretty happy that he'd gained so much from it already. Just as he was smiling to himself about all this, 3 black cars squealed to a stop beside him. More than a dozen men jumped out. The one who looked like a leader, a bald, middle-aged man, said coldly, "Keith Sanderberg?" This bald man had a black snake tattooed on his arm. He looked fierce, and it was obvious that he was from the underworld. Keith saw the tattoo and realized who the man was. He was an infamous local gang leader, nicknamed the Black Snake, and he had a fearsome reputation. It was already past 11 o'clock at night and the streets were empty. There wasn't a single person nearby. The group of thugs was looking for him, and it was obvious that they hadn't come with good intentions. Keith said calmly, "Yes, I'm Keith. What do you want?" The Black Snake and his men were surprised at Keith's cool response. The Black Snake sneered, "You think you're tough, huh? Well, let me tell you, I've been instructed to beat the crap out of you and not stop until you're dead." Keith stayed calm and said, "Did that instruction come from Blake Carrington?" The Black Snake smirked. "You know what you did," he said to one of his subordinates. "Start recording. Once we're done, send it to Carrington so he'll pay up the rest of the money." Immediately, another of the Black Snake's lackeys took out a camera. Judging from his actions and equipment, it seemed that he was quite professional, like he'd done this more than a few times. Seeing Keith's unbothered expression, the Black Snake said coldly, "You deserve everything you're about to get. No wonder Blake said he wanted to end you. There's something he wanted me to tell you. If you're willing to do 3 things, he'll let you go. But now I think I'm going to add something else to that list." Keith said indifferently, "Oh? What are the 3 things? Tell me." The more the Black Snake looked at Keith, the more unpleasant he became. Anyone else would have been scared witless when faced with someone like him, but this kid had the audacity to barely bat an eyelid. He wanted to hit Keith right now, but he'd accepted Blake's money, and he needed to fulfill his side of the deal in order to get the rest. He grinned hideously. "The first thing you need to do is hit yourself in the face until you knock 10 teeth out. The second thing is to find a stick so I can break your fingers. The third thing is for you to kneel down and beg for forgiveness. If you do those 3 things, I won't kill you." The Black Snake saw that Keith only looked at him indifferently, and he said angrily, "But considering your attitude, I'm adding a condition of my own. You can take off your clothes and run away. Maybe then I'll let you live. If you dare say no, I'll break every bone in your body." Keith snorted. "Is that so? You're welcome to try. We'll see whose bones are harder." "You're asking for it, punk," the Black Snake snarled. He shouted to his men, "Attack!" But before he'd even finished speaking, the Black Snake felt a gust of wind by his ears. Suddenly, his forehead hurt, and he could barely stay standing. He looked down and saw a coin rolling past his feet. In the next moment, a black shadow flashed in front of him, and Keith's fist smashed into his face. With a dull crunch, the black snake's nose started bleeding, and he fell to the ground. Keith moved like the wind, dodging the steel pipes that the thugs threw at him. He used another coin to attack. Throwing proficiency skill activated. The system's voice rang out. Someone fell to the ground with a scream, unable to get up again. But by now, Keith was surrounded. The gang was infamous for its brutality, and even the most powerful people in Summerfield didn't dare to cross them. What chance did Keith stand? Hammer fist proficiency activated. Keith unleashed a burst of energy from his body. He pushed his palms forward and formed a fist, unleashing a powerful attack. His power, combined with his 19 dexterity points, meant that the men and their weapons couldn't touch him. He was far more powerful than an average adult. A hit from his fist was like a blow from a hammer, and he could fracture bones in an instant. The black snake was frightened by the scene unfolding before him. His face turned pale as he watched Keith strike down a dozen of his men in seconds. He was taking them out with just one punch each. He'd never seen anything like it. The black snake wanted to faint on the spot, but after meeting Keith's cold gaze, his hair stood on end, and he didn't even dare to pass out. In less than 10 minutes, Keith was the only man left standing. He took a deep breath and stepped on the black snake's face. He said coldly, "What's wrong? Didn't you want to break all the bones in my body?" The black snake cried out in pain. "I'm sorry. I misjudged you. Please, let me go." "Let you go?" Keith sneered. "You were attacking me with steel pipes and machetes just now? Were you going to let me go?" The black snake cried out, "Please spare me. I'll give you money. I'm begging you." At that moment, one of the thugs scrambled to his feet and ran off, screaming in terror. Keith kicked a steel pipe and said, "Activate throwing proficiency." The steel pipe flew straight at the deserter and smashed into his leg. The man fell to the ground with a thud and clutched at his leg. Episode 17, Master of the Game. Keith looked back to the black snake, who was still under his boot, and sneered. "You were so cocky just now. Listen carefully. I'll give you the same chance you're going to give me. Take off your clothes, and you can run away naked." The gang was dumbfounded, but looking at Keith's expression, it didn't seem like he was joking. The black snake knew that if he wanted to live, his only option was to do as Keith said. Reluctantly, he began to take off his clothes. The following scene was truly a spectacle. The hoodlums undressed and stood in front of Keith. Keith didn't hesitate to use the camera they had brought to record the scene and send it to his phone. Once he was done, Keith said, "You should be smarter in the future. If I see you again, I'll teach you another lesson. Now get lost." The gang looked as though they'd been pardoned from the guillotine. They grabbed their clothes and limped away. Watching them go, Keith's expression was terrifyingly calm. You've shattered the gang's wish to teach you a lesson. Attribute point +1. You've thwarted Blake's plan for revenge. Attribute point +1. Keith added 1 point to power and another to dexterity. Just as he was about to leave, the voice of the system sounded again. One of your attributes has reached 20. You receive a random reward. Do you wish to draw your reward now? Keith was delighted when he heard this, and he asked, "System, what's the meaning of this reward?" When any of the host's attributes reach 20, 30, or 40 points, the host will receive a random reward. The reward may be a skill, or perhaps one wish value or one attribute point. Keith nodded and said, "I'll take it now." Drawing reward for host. Please wait a moment. Keith prayed with all his might that it would be a new skill. Said the system, "You've obtained a new skill. Master of the game." Master of the game? Keith opened his mouth. His prayers had been answered, but the skill he'd gained wasn't much use to him at all. Well, I guess it's better than a wish value. He smiled to himself for a moment before his face darkened again. Blake. Keith walked in the opposite direction of the police barracks until he reached Shallow Water Bay, one of the wealthiest suburbs in Summerfield. Such a place naturally had the strictest security measures. Surveillance cameras were everywhere, as well as security guards who patrolled at night and countless infrared sensors. A gust of wind blew past, and one of the security guards seemed to sense something. He looked around and found nothing unusual, so he lowered his head and yawned again. Keith arrived at a large villa. After taking a deep breath, he launched a kick at the front door. The door shook violently, and with just a few more kicks, it collapsed. Blake's family woke up at the commotion. The bodyguards downstairs rushed over, only to be greeted by Keith's iron fists and flying coins. The two bodyguards were caught off guard and were soon knocked out on the ground. Magnus Carrington and his wife rushed out to check on the situation and were shocked when they saw the young man downstairs. Magnus knew all about Keith. He'd been the one to contact the Black Snake to take revenge for his son Blake. Keith stood proudly in the living room and raised his head to look into Magnus's eyes. His expression was angry, and Magnus was a little scared. He knew that he was in big trouble today. "Mr. Carrington," Keith waved the camera in his hand. He said coldly, "Since you're the one responsible for all this, why don't you come down and have a chat with me?" Magnus had been in the business for dozens of years, and he'd experienced enough to stay calm in the situation. He whispered to his wife beside him, "Take Blake out the back door and run." However, before he could finish speaking, a coin glinting with a cold light brushed past his ears, shattering a beautiful crystal lamp behind them. Keith smiled faintly and said, "Ma'am, I came to visit you especially. Are you leaving already? That's no way to treat your guests, is it?" Magnus's wife had never been faced with such a threatening situation. She was so scared that her knees went weak and she almost collapsed. By now, the rest of the security guards in the villa had heard the news and rushed over. The head security guard looked at the scene in front of him and said in surprise, "Mr. Carrington, what's going on?" Magnus was relieved, but when he saw Keith waving the camera in his hand, he knew that Keith must have evidence of his crimes. He had no choice but to go along with Keith's act. His voice was a little shaky as he said, "It's fine, Bobby. This is a family friend. There's nothing to worry about. You can be on your way." The head of security wasn't a fool. He could tell that the current situation was definitely not right. But everyone who lived here had their secrets. And if the boss had said to leave, it wasn't the security guard's job to interfere in other people's matters. So he looked at Keith again and nodded. I'm glad everything is all right. I'll leave you to it, sir. He led his men out of the room, stopping briefly to pick up the smashed door and prop it against the frame. Keith smiled faintly and said, Mr. Carrington, seems that you've already figured this out. Where's Blake? Don't you want him to join us? Magnus knew that Keith had come to cause trouble, and he became even more nervous. He knew very well that the current situation was disadvantageous to him. This kid had taken care of his bodyguards with just a few moves. His martial arts skills were amazing, and he was still holding the video camera that Magnus had given to the Black Snake. The video camera held evidence that Magnus had paid the Black Snake to kill Keith. If the news spread, the Carrington family would lose an astronomical amount of money. He might even go to jail. Magnus let a long sigh and said to his wife, Go and get Blake. I believe Keith is a responsible person. He won't make things difficult for us. When Keith heard his words, he smiled and said, Mr. Carrington, it seems that you've already thought about this matter, but you got one thing wrong. I'm not a reasonable person. If someone attacks me, I'll take my revenge. Magnus didn't seem surprised, but his wife was so scared by Keith's words that she crumpled to the ground. After a moment, Keith sat on the couch. Magnus and his family came downstairs and sat opposite him. Blake trembled and looked at Keith in fear. He'd never thought that a loser like Keith could overpower him and his family. Even if his father was CEO of the Carrington Group, he had no way to deal with Keith. Blake was very afraid. He was afraid that once Keith got angry, he would beat him to a pulp, and Keith now had evidence that they'd committed a crime. His father had too much to lose to risk letting this go public. Whatever Keith wanted to do now, Blake realized that his father would probably choose to swallow his anger. The room was bathed in silence. Magnus looked at Keith, who was sitting opposite him, and his brows furrowed deeper and deeper. Magnus knew very well that in this kind of negotiation, whoever made the first request would put themselves on the back foot. But he thought Keith wouldn't know this and would speak first, since he seemed to have the upper hand. But he hadn't expected Keith to be so calm. The younger man didn't have the impetuous temper of most people his age. Sighing inwardly, Magnus finally spoke up. Tell me, what do you want? You've shattered Magnus's desire to gain the upper hand in the negotiation. Attribute point +1. Keith kept his face calm as he said, Blake, I heard from the Black Snake that you wanted me to do 3 things, and if I satisfied those conditions, he wouldn't kill me. Is that true? Blake's heart skipped a beat, and a strong sense of unease welled up in his chest. Keith said indifferently, I'm a fair person. The 3 things you wanted me to do, I'll ask of you in return. If you don't want to do them, fine. I won't break all the bones in your body. However, the headlines tomorrow will tell the tale of a conflict between the heir to one of the country's biggest empires and his love rival. The papers will report how the father of the heir arranged assassins to kill this love rival. You understand what I'm saying? right? The three things that Blake had asked Keith to do were terrifying. Now that they'd been turned on Blake, he was so scared that he couldn't speak. He could only look at his father in panic. Magnus looked at his son with disappointment. Compared to Keith, his son looked like a coward. Magnus hesitated for a moment and said,
"Young man, I'm willing to pay to make this trouble go away. Name your price."
Keith sneered and said, "Was I talking to you? I asked Blake a question." Magnus said angrily,
"Keith, that's enough. Our family won't be trifled with."
"All right," Keith said. "If you don't want to talk about it, fine. See you then." Magnus was shocked that Keith was going to leave. He knew that if Keith left, things would get even worse. He hurriedly said,
"Oh, wait a minute."
Keith paused, and Magnus went on.
"I also know about the 3 conditions the Black Snake gave you. I'll give you $200,000 for each one. How about that?"
Keith smiled faintly when he heard that. $600,000? It's too cheap for the mighty Carrington family. You don't think I'm an idiot, do you? Hearing this, Magnus breathed a sigh of relief. If it was a case of not enough money, he could always add more, as long as Keith was willing to negotiate. He said in a deep voice,
"How much do you want? Name a price."
Keith looked at the businessman, who thought he was smart, and laughed. "Mr. Carrington, it seems you misunderstood me. I'll talk money with you, but not for those 3 things." Magnus's face fell, and Keith said calmly, "You know how the saying goes, an eye for an eye. If you dare to send an assassin after me, you have to bear the consequences. Your son needs to be disciplined. If you don't teach him a lesson, he'll make the same mistake again next time." The 3 members of the Carrington family sucked in a cold breath of air. Keith's intention was obvious. He wanted Blake to be held to the same conditions that the Black Snake had given him. Blake collapsed onto the couch, trembling like a leaf. You've shattered Magnus's intention to buy his way out of disaster. Attribute point +1. Magnus clenched his fists, but at the sight of Keith's cold gaze, he didn't dare look Keith in the eye. He could see the disdain in the young man's expression, as if he, the powerful Magnus Carrington, were no more than an ant. What kind of person would dare to look at him with such disdain? The powerful man was afraid now. After all, no matter how rich he was still just a businessman. He knew how to talk about business, but in such a dangerous situation, he had no idea what to do. Keith saw that the Carringtons had frozen and sneered. "Well, what is it?" "I'll count down to 3. If you don't decide by then, you'll just have to wait for the headlines. 3, 2, 1.
Wait."
Magnus seemed to have made up his mind. Without any further warning, he slapped his son and knocked out one of his teeth. Keith was slightly stunned when he saw this. He sat back on the couch and watched Magnus hit his son. The blows reverberated around the room. Magnus ignored his wife's cries and his son's screams. He seemed to be venting his anger as he hit Blake over and over. By the time Magnus stopped, Blake's cheeks had swollen up. Keith looked at Blake, who now had several missing teeth and a blotchy red face. He nodded and said, "Mr. Carrington, you did it for the company. You're a ruthless man." Keith walked over to one of the unconscious bodyguards and picked up the man's baton. He threw it to Magnus and said, "Now, the second one. You can start. No! Blake's mom suddenly grabbed her husband's arm and cried, No, I can't bear to see my son tortured anymore. Don't hit him. Magnus pushed Gwen away and said angrily to Keith,
I'm not as vicious as you are.
He picked up the short stick and swung it down toward his son's fingers. Gwen screamed just as the baton was about to hit Blake's hand. A cold light flashed in front of her eyes. A coin hit Magnus's hand, and he dropped the stick. As Keith played with the other coin in his hand and said with a faint smile, I was just joking. Why would you take it so seriously? Forget it. After all, I've known Blake for a while. His fingers don't need to be broken. You can pay me some compensation for the distress he caused me, and then I'll consider the matter closed. Looking at Blake's bloody face, Keith continued, But I hope he understands that if he dares to try to retaliate again, it won't be as simple as a few broken fingers next time. When Keith said this, everyone on the scene heaved a sigh of relief. Gwen's entire body shuddered as she cried and hugged her son, who had lost consciousness. You satisfy Magnus and Gwen's desire not to see their son's fingers broken. Wish value +1. Current progress 6 of 10. Magnus sat down on the couch with a bitter smile on his face.
You son of a bitch. If you're really joking, why didn't you say something before I knocked my son's teeth out?
Magnus didn't know why Keith had decided to stop him at the last second, but he'd saved his son's fingers. He felt a twisted sort of gratitude towards their tormentor. Magnus took a deep breath and forced himself to calm down.
How much do you want? I'll transfer the money to you now.
Keith thought for a second, and then his face darkened. Mr. Carrington, if you transfer more than $1 million, the bank will get suspicious. Even now, you still want to scheme against me. I underestimated you. Magnus was shocked that Keith had seen through his plan so easily. How could such a young man have this level of awareness? What Magnus didn't realize was that Keith had activated his optimal logic skill. Every word that Magnus said was analyzed by the optimal logic in order to figure out his true motives. You've uncovered Magnus's desire to plot against you. Attribute point +1. Keith's ability to control the situation and think about the future made Magnus think twice about playing tricks on him. He sighed and said,
All right, kid, I'll be straight with you. Right now, I can give you $3 million in cash. I'll give it all to you as compensation. However, in return, you have to give me the camera in your hand. How about this matter ends here? Keith smiled and said,
You're a straightforward person, Mr. Carrington. I said no more than $1 million to be wired, but $990,000 shouldn't be a problem, right? Magnus smiled bitterly and nodded.
All right, $3 million in cash and a $990,000 bank transfer. I'll give it to you now.
He turned to Gwen and said,
Go and take out all the money in the safe.
Gwen nodded and looked at Keith meaningfully before heading upstairs. At the same time, Magnus asked for Keith's bank details and transferred the other $990,000 to him. Keith was surprised to see the business tycoon being so straightforward, and he wondered if he'd asked for too little. But he'd caused a huge ruckus in the Carrington family. He'd also gotten the money and he'd achieved his goal of deterring further attacks. It was a good choice for him to leave now. A few minutes later, Gwen returned and handed Keith a duffel bag. Keith looked inside and nodded in satisfaction before tossing the camera into Magnus's hands. He smiled and said, "You've suffered a great loss. You won't let me go just like that, will you?" Magnus wanted to say something, but Keith waved his hand and said, "You don't have to lie, but I advise you not to make an enemy of me. It won't end well for you." Magnus shook his head and suddenly said seriously,
"If only you were my son."
Keith was slightly stunned when he heard that. He stared at Magnus in silence for a few seconds. Then he turned and walked out into the darkness. Magnus, who had returned to the room, hurriedly turned on the camera. After watching for a while, he smiled bitterly again. There was no evidence inside. Instead, there was the black snake and naked photos of his crew. Magnus was confused. As a leader of the underworld, how could the black snake leave any evidence behind? He walked to the window and looked in the direction where Keith had disappeared. He was angry and scared. After a moment, he seemed to have a thought of something, and his eyes flashed. "You fulfilled Magnus's wish to have the camera. Wish value +1. Progress 7 of 10. When he returned to the hospital, Keith was in a good mood. He hid the duffel bag with the $3 million under his bed. This time, besides obtaining a large amount of money, he also gained 2 wish values and 2 attribute points. After hesitating for a moment, Keith added the attribute points to his stamina. His attributes were now as follows: Power 14, Dexterity 20, Stamina 13, Charm 3, Wish value 7 of 10. Although he'd successfully defeated the Black Snake and his gang, Keith could clearly feel that he was a little tired. His dexterity was high, and his power was too. However, in order to fully utilize these 2 attributes, he needed more stamina to support him. Keith knew that even the strongest man could be outnumbered. If his stamina wasn't high enough, and he had too many opponents, things could get dangerous. The optimal logic skill allowed him to predict these kinds of things. Keith had humiliated the Carrington family. Although Magnus was playing ball now, the fact that he'd hired a group of gangsters to avenge his son proved that he was a man who held a grudge. Perhaps one day he would seek revenge again, and the next time might not be so simple. Although Keith wasn't afraid, he knew he had to be prepared. He needed to improve his stamina. First of all, he wanted to prevent his opponents from using a large number of people to exhaust him until they could finally kill him. A warm current surged through his body, and Keith could feel that his aura had grown stronger. He smiled and closed his eyes to sleep. The next morning, Keith left the hospital early with his bag of money. He split up the $3 million cash and deposited it into different bank accounts. By the time he'd finished, it was already afternoon. He looked at the nearly $4 million in his bank account, and a slow smile spread over his face. He was rich. Keith wandered through the park for a while and found some animals to help out. He obtained 2 wish values and ability points, increasing his total wish value to 9 of 10 and his stamina to 15 points. It was almost too easy. Keith had been staying in the police barracks to make it easier for him to get to work. But now that he had money, he could start to consider a new living arrangement. Of course, he didn't plan to buy a house just yet. Although $4 million could buy a nice house in Summerfield, he didn't have any other savings, and he'd only just gotten this money. He didn't want to blow it all right away. Also, it would be difficult to explain to his parents how he'd managed to get enough money to buy a house, so he decided it'd be better to rent a place first. Once he had a stable income, he would buy a place of his own. The next morning, he made his way to the real estate office and politely asked the woman at the counter, "Excuse me, miss, I'd like to rent a property. Can you show me some of your properties?" This was a high-end real estate agency, and there weren't many customers. The woman at the front desk, who was playing with her phone, looked up at him. She saw that Keith was wearing unbranded clothes and didn't look remotely rich. She habitually looked out the door, but there wasn't even a car parked up. She snorted and threw over a brochure. "Here, take a look for yourself." Keith wasn't angry. He smiled and started to read the information. With his instant memorization ability, it only took a moment for him to find something. There was a spacious apartment on the 3rd floor of White Pine Gardens, with 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms. The price was $4,000 per month, but it required an upfront payment of half a year's rent. White Pine Gardens was a newly built complex. The location wasn't bad, but the main point was that it was close to Harvard. Harvard was the school he wanted to go to, and he had a decent chance of getting into it. That's why he decided this was the apartment for him. He was just about to ask the receptionist about it when the roar of a sports car suddenly cut through the air. A Mercedes coupe screeched to a stop outside, and a fashionable young couple climbed out and headed into the realtor's office. When the woman at the counter saw this, she stopped playing with her phone and ran over to welcome them in. The way she fawned all over them was the polar opposite of how she had just treated Keith. Under the guidance of the receptionist, the stylish young couple walked in with their heads held high, and the other customers in the office all looked over. The young man in sunglasses barged past Keith without a word and said arrogantly, "Do you have a house near Harvard? Pick the best one for me." The receptionist took the brochure from Keith's hands and flipped through it. "There's only one property available in that area right now. What a coincidence." "Oh," the man in shades said happily. "I'll take it. Money isn't a problem. Find someone to take me to see it." Keith frowned when he heard that. He said, "I'm sorry. I was here first, and I wanted to rent that place." The stylish young woman glanced at Keith with a look of disdain that matched her partner's. "You want to rent a place in the school district? I think you'd be better suited to the slums." The receptionist was clearly biased towards the couple and said, "Sir, although you were here first, the school's district rent is high. I don't think it would be suitable for you. If you wait a moment, I'll help you choose somewhere better suited to your budget, okay?" "Oh?" Keith turned a deaf ear to the receptionist's words. He looked at the rich couple and said lightly, "What did you say just now? I didn't hear it clearly." The man in shades was slightly taken aback when he heard that. He looked at Keith and said, "We said you should be in the slums. What are you going to do about it?" "What am I going to do?" Keith laughed and said, "Even Magnus Carrington doesn't dare talk to me like that. You're brave." The rest of the office was stunned. Magnus Carrington was a hotshot tycoon. The man in the sunglasses was indeed rich, but compared to Magnus, he was nothing. He shut his mouth and wondered what Keith's background was. Keith sneered, looked at the receptionist, and said, "The rent is $4,000, right? I'll pay $7,000. I want that apartment." The receptionist opened her mouth and looked at Keith in disbelief. It wasn't common knowledge, but she knew that this agency was part of the Carrington Group. If Keith really did have some relation to Magnus, with just one word from him, she'd be fired on the spot. She looked at Keith, then turned to the rich couple, at a total loss as to what to do. The man in shades stared at Keith. Keith had clearly wanted to humiliate him, and in front of his girlfriend as well. He was in a difficult situation, and he said angrily, "Stop bragging. I'll pay $8,000 a month." Keith's face darkened, and he said, "Well, I'll pay $12,000. "What?" Everyone gasped once again. $12,000? The other man's face turned ashen, and he fell silent. Seeing this, Keith smiled and said, "You were so sure of yourself just a moment ago. How about this? Apologize to me, and then take your girlfriend and get out of here. I'll forget this ever happened. Otherwise, you'll need that $8,000 to cover your medical expenses." "You're threatening me?" The man's face turned red, and the woman beside him looked at Keith with fear. Suddenly, the guy in shades seemed to think of something. He laughed and said, "You said 12,000, but this place needs 6 months in advance. Are you seriously telling me you have $72,000 ready to drop on the deposit?" The more he thought about it, the more he felt it made sense. He said loudly, "If you can prove to me you have $72,000, I'll bow down and kiss your shoes." Even the receptionist seemed to come back to her senses at this, and she cast a doubtful look at Keith. "Sir, this is a high-end agency. Unless you're serious and have the money, please don't waste our time." Keith looked from the young couple to the receptionist and smirked. He took his phone out of his pocket. The onlookers held their breath. That was a brand new iPhone Pro Max. It was not a cheap phone. Perhaps this kid really did have $72,000. Keith pulled up his various bank balances. On the screen, it showed that the total was $3.97 million. There was the sound of several people drawing their breath at once. Then, there was complete silence. The receptionist's face turned red and then pale again. The man in shades was stunned. The next moment, his face turned red too. Thinking of what he'd just said, he really wanted to find a hole to hide in. After the initial shock, the stylish young woman beside him looked at Keith with a different expression. If Keith's aura hadn't been so strong, she would definitely have gone and sucked up to him. "You fulfilled the wish of the crowd to watch the show. Wish value +1. Progress 10 of 10. You can make a wish. You've broken the man and the receptionist's wish to get rid of you. Attribute point +1. Keith put away his phone and looked at the other man's red face. He said calmly, "You said it yourself. If you want to kneel down and kiss my shoes, please, go ahead. The man in the shade's face turned even redder. Under the watchful eyes of the crowd that had gathered, he didn't know whether to stay or go. At that moment, a new group of people came through the door. A beautiful lady walked in, followed by several bodyguards in black suits. When the receptionist saw her, she quickly went over to greet her. "Hello, Director Carrington." The lady nodded. "My family's Shallow Bay Villa." "Ah!" Before she could finish her sentence, she spotted Keith and exclaimed, "Keith, why are you here?" Keith said with a faint smile, "Oh, Director Carrington, if you can do business here, why can't I?" The lady was Gwen Carrington, who had been so scared by Keith last night that her knees had gone weak and she'd crumpled to the floor. "Ah!" Gwen stuttered for a moment before nodding to her bodyguards and turning around to leave. However, Keith's faint voice came from behind her. "Since you only just got here," he said, "why are you in such a hurry to leave?" Gwen trembled at Keith's words, and her reaction made the onlookers' eyes drop out of their sockets. Their mouths fell open in shock. Gwen was Magnus Carrington's wife and also the vice chairman of the Carrington Group. She often appeared on TV and was known across the entire state. And now, it appeared that this upper-class lady knew Keith. In fact, they seemed to be quite familiar with each other. More importantly, she seemed to be afraid of Keith. Who was this handsome guy dressed in such ordinary clothes? Once the couple and the receptionist overcame their initial shock, their expressions became very ugly. The man in shades even trembled slightly. His father's wealth was nothing compared to the Carrington Group's. Keith took a look at everyone's expressions and said indifferently, "Miss Carrington, I heard that you're the boss here. You don't follow the rules when doing things?" As he spoke, he looked at the receptionist. His meaning was obvious. Gwen was very nervous at this moment. Although she knew that Keith wouldn't do anything to her, she was very afraid. She took a deep breath and calmed her emotions down. Then she looked at the receptionist and said, "You're fired." The receptionist's face turned pale. She almost cried. She suddenly grabbed Keith's sleeve and said, "Sir, I'm sorry, I was wrong. I need this job. Please forgive me. Are you free tonight? I'll treat you to dinner as an apology." Keith frowned. He saw that the receptionist was about to cry. She even hinted that she would compensate him with her body. It seemed that this job was really important to her. Keith sighed and said, "You don't have to treat me to dinner. You're not my employee. I don't have the right to decide whether or not to fire you." As he spoke, he looked at Gwen and said, "Does your company not have rules and regulations? Mrs. Carrington, aren't you being a little too hasty?" As Gwen calmed down, she began to understand that it must have been her employees and the rich young couple who'd caused the problem. Even her husband was afraid of Keith, and Gwen was deeply worried that Keith wouldn't be happy. She hurriedly nodded and said, "You're right. I'll look into the matter and make sure it's taken care of properly." The onlookers were stunned when they heard this. Gwen was treating Keith like he was the president of her company. The receptionist was relieved and looked at Keith gratefully. "You fulfilled the receptionist's wish of not being fired. Wish value, +1. Current progress, 11 of 10. With the matter settled, all that was left was to deal with the guy in shades. Keith looked at him indifferently and didn't say a word. Immediately, all eyes in the room gathered on the rich young couple. The man clenched his teeth slightly and his expression was incomparably ugly. He looked at Gwen, then at his girlfriend beside him. Finally, he saw Keith's gaze and knew that he had no choice but to apologize immediately. If Gwen decided to take this out on his family's business, his father would be bankrupt in no time. The man in shades made up his mind. He prepared to kneel down to kiss Keith's shoes, but a hand stopped him. Keith stood the man back up, took off his sunglasses, and said lightly, "Forget about it. Keep your pride." Keith pushed him aside and said with a cold voice, "Take your girlfriend and get lost. Don't let me see you again." When the man in shades heard this, he apologized and escaped. "You fulfilled the man's wish of not kissing your shoes. Wish value +1. Progress 12 of 10. Gwen looked at Keith's calm expression and felt a trace of curiosity in her heart. Keith had spoken up on behalf of the receptionist and stopped the guy in shades from humiliating himself in front of everyone. It gave her a new understanding of him. She remembered how, at the critical moment last night, Keith had also stopped her husband from breaking her son's fingers. This was another side to the young man by who she was so intimidated. Keith wasn't cruel. Instead, he showed mercy. Maybe he wasn't that scary after all. When Gwen realized this, she didn't feel as frightened anymore. Instead, she found herself wanting to know more about this enigmatic young man. But right now, Keith wasn't interested in Gwen's thoughts. He said to the receptionist, who was still in a daze, "Why are you standing there? Hurry up and get the ball rolling. I want to rent the apartment." "Oh, okay. Right away, sir." The receptionist trembled. Of course, she didn't dare mention the matter of the $72,000 and quickly completed the necessary paperwork. "Sir, please wait a moment. There will be an agent to take you to the apartment right away." Before Keith could say anything, Gwen said, "Why don't I drive you over there?" "Huh?" Keith was slightly stunned and looked at Gwen with a frown. She'd been so scared a moment ago. Why did she want to take him to the apartment now? Keith was puzzled, and even if he'd used his optimal logic, he couldn't have guessed what Gwen's intentions were. But he had a plan. After taking the key from the receptionist, he smiled faintly and said, "My legs work just fine. There's no need to trouble you." He didn't look at Gwen's expression, but walked steadily out of the realtor's office instead. Keith had 3 charm points, which meant that people would instinctively have a good impression of him. Once he smiled, no matter if it was at Gwen, the receptionist, or the other people in the office, their hearts skipped for no apparent reason. Gwen stared blankly at Keith's back. Though her heart had stopped racing, she still felt a little uncomfortable. When she offered to take Keith to see the room, she was shocked by her own words, but she still hadn't expected Keith to reject her, and he hadn't even bothered to look at her. The whole situation gave her a strange feeling in her heart. "Am I really that old?" she thought to herself. Keith looked back at the realtor's office, and a faint smile appeared on his face. He knew this agency belonged to the Carrington Group. In fact, that was why he'd come here. His purpose was clear. He wanted to let Magnus know where he lived so that Magnus wouldn't go to his parents' house when he wanted revenge. Keith's family had always been his weakness. As soon as he was earning some decent money, he'd buy a high-end property with full security so that he could be completely at ease. Keith walked down the road and said in his head, "System, I want to make a wish. I want to have the ability to move quickly." Successful wish. Host has obtained a skill, wind walking. Description: host's movement speed will increase by 300% after activating the skill. The chance of dodging will increase by 100%. Note, the duration of this skill is based on the host's stamina. When stamina is used up, the skill will stop. Keith was delighted. He'd long wanted to have this ability. He could protect himself and escape, and if anything happened to his family, he could be there in no time. What surprised him most was that his dodging rate increased by 100%. If he wanted to succeed in the future, he knew he would have to offend others. He might even end up being shot at. The ability to dodge bullets was exactly what he wanted. He asked the system some careful questions about his new skills and discovered that the probability of successful dodging was based on dexterity.